The type of soil you use for your houseplants can greatly hinder or help your success when it comes to taking care of houseplants, and this is a massively confusing world. Do I get chunky soil, moisture retentive soil, houseplant soil? There are so many options out there. I'm Tanner the Planter, and this is the truth about houseplants. Now, even though the type of soil you use isn't absolutely going to determine your success, by choosing the right ingredients, you can make your job as a plant parent infinitely easier or harder. These are the three types of soil that I mainly use. We're going to get to each one of these because each one of these is going to need or do best in different soil ingredients. But today, we are going to cover the Calathea or Maranta. Now, this job is going to get a little messy, so I've got a couple of aprons up here, a customized apron that we've got over here, Crazy Plant Dad, and then we've got our very own Famous in Oregon smocks. This is the ones that all of our employees wear here. So which ones do you think I should wear? You know what, I think I'm gonna go with this one. It's vintage. I wore it years ago when I worked at the store here full time, and I think it's a perfect candidate for getting dirty and making some soils. Now, to understand soil selection, you're going to need to understand plant anatomy. This isn't a big super scientific class, don't worry, it's very simple. We look at 3 points of water storage, 3 points of plant anatomy. That's going to be the leaves, the stems, and finally the roots down here. Now, there are points of water storage on other plants like cuticle and rhizomes, but not all plants have that. It's safe to say that all plants have leaves, stems, and roots to some degree, so we use those as the 3 measuring tools to determine how much water storage a plant has. And then we can balance out that water storing anatomy with the soil ingredients that we choose. So the first thing I want to do is look at my leaves. Do my leaves have a lot of water storage in it? You'll know a plant or a leaf, a point of anatomy, has water storage if it's very thick and robust. If we look at the leaves right here, of this Calathea, they're very thin, they're pliable. I can bend this thing in half and it pops right back. A succulent leaf or a leaf that had a lot of water storage in it wouldn't do that. They don't bend in half. So this is 0 for 1 on the water storing scale. Next up, we're gonna look at the stems of the plant. The stems of this plant are kind of thick. You can see they're almost as thick as my little chopstick that we have going on right here. I would say this is kind of in between the point of water storage and a point of not water storage. I'd give it maybe a half of point. I'll show you a full point on some of our other plants later on. Finally, we want to look at the roots. Now, a root system that stores water would be very, very thick, very robust. You want it to be kind of super thick, sort of like this chopstick that we have going on right here. So when we take this plant out of the pot, you can see that the roots are very thin, they're very fibrous. So we don't have any points of water storage here either. So now in recap, we've looked at the leaves, no points of water storage. We've looked at the stem, maybe a half a point if I'm being generous, but overall I would just say not a point of water storage. And finally at the roots, very thin, very fibrous, also not a point of water storage. So we have 0 for 3 on the water storing capabilities or the water storing anatomy of this plant. So how does that affect the type of soil we choose to use for our plant? When we don't have any points of water storage, we want to balance that out with putting more water storage in the pot, so that we are putting water storage actually in the soil so that those roots constantly have something to grab from moisture, because again, they're gonna run out of moisture in their leaves, stems, and roots very quickly because they don't really store water. So by putting moisture retaining properties in the soil, that's sort of acting like they're water storing. We're helping them in an environment that they wouldn't naturally live in your home, thousands of miles away from where they live naturally in the jungle, for example. So here's my recipe for my plant that does not have any moisture retaining capabilities. You'll notice that I have 3 parts peat moss right here. This is our moisture retaining properties right here. I always like to have, when my plant does not have any moisture storing capabilities, I like to bulk up on the moisture storing ingredients, okay? Because this is going to act as our moisture retention. So we always want to make sure that we have more moisture retaining capabilities for our plants that don't have the ability to store a whole lot of moisture. So that's 3 parts peat moss for that one. I like to go through and make sure all the clumps are out. You can just use your fingers if you want. You can chop it up with your Tanner the Planter chopsticks if you really need to. This part isn't super important. You don't need to be extremely thorough, but every little bit helps, right? Okay, next up, we're going to add our little bits of sand in there. Now the sand, we're gonna be adding a little bit of aeration in there. Like I said, no matter how little the plant's ability to store water is, I always like to add a little bit of aeration, a little bit of drainage in here. That's your fail-safe. That's going to help you make sure you don't get root rot in your plants. Whenever you're adding aeration or drainage into your potted plants, that's going to decrease your risk of root rot, which is definitely one of the #1 reasons for plants not doing well. Once you've got that nice and incorporated, we're going to add our perlite. We got to mix that in really well also. Take your time here. This is one of those activities, you know, that shouldn't be stressful. It should be enjoyable. I always say, you know, the hobby should be enjoyable, and as soon as it's no longer enjoyable, it's time to reassess it. So definitely, you know, I always recommend, hey, I got to make some soil this weekend. I got to repot some plants this weekend. Let's make a little day out of it. Let's set some time aside. Let's put on your favorite podcast, maybe some nice music, whatever you like, whatever gets you in the zone, and do it up that way. So right now I've got 3 parts peat moss. I've got 1 part horticultural sand. You want to make sure it's horticultural sand also, by the way. You don't want a whole bunch of salt in there. So make sure it's washed in for plants. You can usually find it at your big box stores, your garden centers, what have you. And then finally, I'm going to add in my worm castings. I'm not going to add this entire thing. You only need a couple of tablespoons. That's going to be perfectly fine. I don't have a measuring spoon. I'm just going to measure with my planty heart over here. You can't really overdo it, so that's a good thing, right? We're gonna mix that all in. We're gonna incorporate that in super, super well. Get it all mixed in. We're looking good. Now you gotta flatten it down. You pop this in the oven for about 35, just kidding. This is perfectly acceptable for a lot of your plants that don't have any moisture retaining properties in their anatomy. And so I'm gonna fill this pot up right here now, and we're gonna see just exactly how fast this drains. This will be very apparent when we go into our aeroid soil, which is going to be next, and then finally our cactus soil. You can see the differences by just how fast, when you're mixing yours up at home, this is how fast your general purpose houseplant soil mix should drain. All right, so now that you have all your houseplant soil mixed up and you want to check it against mine if you're making yours at home, this is how quickly it should drain. Now remember, this is our moisture storing, our moisture retaining mixture right here. So we're just going to pour it on here. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. There we go. So it should take about 4 or 5 seconds for you to start to see the moisture coming out of the bottom drainage holes. This is a fantastic moisture storing soil for your houseplants right here. I would recommend adding more nutrients as you go on. Proper fertilizing, of course, is always key because again, we're not actually using any soil. It's a very nutrient deficient soil right here. The worm castings do help a little bit, but I always recommend fertilizing in your soil as well as you move forward. Now, again, like I said, this should be an enjoyable hobby. If part of making the hobby enjoyable to you is mixing up your own soils, that's perfectly fine. That's what this video is for. If you don't want to mix up your own soils, don't worry. We have a whole selection of soils on our website right now, including our general purpose houseplant soil. It comes pre-mixed with all of the ingredients that you see right here, including our high quality worm castings. So if you want to skip the work, skip the mixing, skip the aprons, go ahead and pick yourself up a bag of our soil right here. We'll get it shipped out to you ASAP. And don't forget, whenever you use our soils, you need to slap that pot and slap that subscribe button.